Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the podcast, Jeffery sits down with Royston Da Costa, Assistant Group Treasurer at Ferguson PLC, to discuss the topic of the impact of fraud on Treasury practices. This insightful interview covers the biggest challenges on cyber fraud today, including Treasury's responsibility to protect and the leading practices to safeguard corporates and banks from an array of vital threats. Listen in on the discussion.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Jeffery. I'm here with Royston Da Costa, who's the Assistant Group Treasurer of Ferguson. We're discussing the impact of fraud on Treasury practices. Royston and his team are a TMI award winner on technology excellence on future-proofing Treasury. I'm delighted to have him here. Welcome to the podcast, Royston.
Thank you, Craig, for having me on the podcast. So let me start by telling you a bit about who Ferguson is and what my role is within Ferguson. Ferguson is the world's leading specialist distributor of plumbing and heating products. As of the end of July 2018, our turnover was just over $20 billion and our trading profit was $1.5 billion. Our largest subsidiary is based in the US in Newport News, Virginia. Hence the reason why we changed our name to Ferguson, and the board wants to recognize that over 90% of our turnover is now generated in the US. We are, like I'm based in the UK, the rest of the Group Treasury function, and we are a fairly decentralized business. I've been with Ferguson came up to 17 years. I've done a number of roles within the Treasury function since I joined. This particular role I've got now, which is really driving our technology strategy for the group, and amongst other responsibilities, I also am responsible for the payments controls and compliance regulation that we have to meet as a group in terms of Treasury requirements. I've been in Treasury over 29 years. I've worked for companies like Gillette, Sky, and Vivendi Universal. I've worked obviously in many other aspects of Treasury, including cash management, foreign exchange. But it's fair to say, in terms of the role I'm currently in, probably for now 3 years, it's taken a much greater focus on technology and really looking ahead at what's coming up and likely to impact certainly our group here, Treasury terms, and also the industry.
So we are definitely going to have you on a podcast talking about technology then, Royston. Royston also has joined us on the FinTech Hot Seat, which we do video recordings at the AFP annual conference. So again, welcome, Royston. So today's topic is the impact of fraud on Treasury practices. And let's begin with the situation of fraud. What's going on? And then let's move on to what's Treasury's responsibility in terms of protection. But maybe you could step through where you see fraud today. What are the issues? How would you describe what you see in talking with your peers?
I guess the big challenge that we face in Treasury in terms of fraud is, if I can describe, it feels like you're in a bucket with multiple holes. And I think to some degree, there are certain companies, perhaps even treasurers out there, that not kind of feeling very comfortable as to how does one actually plug all these holes. And it's partly, or I think primarily due to the fact that obviously the internet has become a much more common platform for people to engage in business. And as a result of that, there's been a lot more risk, I say, that we've had to contend with. But I like using an expression that one of our TMS, our vendors use, CEO for that vendor uses, which is, you cannot boil the ocean. This is not something that anyone's going to be able to fix on their own, and certainly not instantly. So clearly we're all aware in our personal lifestyles as much as in business lifestyle of the various threats that exist out there. So I like to approach it from the perspective that certainly when you look at cybercrime, cyber fraud, as a company, you would have and should have all the appropriate protection, like you'd argue, and policies in place to ensure that you're a good corporate citizen. Now, again, that needs a lot more detail and clarification, because it's not as glib as that. Where does one start? So actually written a paper in conjunction with our TMS vendor on how companies go about trying to protect themselves from the threat of cyber fraud and looking at the various, the threats that exist out there. And this is great to your question, Craig, about the fact that you've got the different types of fraud that exist, and I'm sure there are many more than just this in terms of distributed denial of service, DDoS. You've got the different types of phishing that go on. So you've got phishing, you've got the phishing PH, and so on and so forth. But as much as all of these types of threats exist out there, and we should be aware of them and certainly should learn how to deal with them and protect ourselves as much as our companies that we work for against them, I believe there's also a call here for the vendors and the banks and then our third-party providers to also work with us, protect us or help us protect ourselves, let's say. And what I'm referring to there specifically is this. If you take the example of making a payment, which is clearly one of the major areas that most corporates would argue is an issue when it comes to cybercrime and fraud, without question, as a customer, as a corporate, we are responsible for the security and the process around making that payment. So up to the point that that payment is actually released to the instructions released to the bank, we are responsible for making sure that we protect and apply good practice in, for example, password setting and educate our employees to ensure that they are not acting upon scam emails and so on and so forth. But I believe that banks, certainly, and fintechs can help equally as much in developing technologies like biometric, like two-factor authentication or even four-factor authentication to help reduce the amount of responsibility in some ways or the onus, particularly on the smaller corporates who don't have perhaps the numbers in terms of their teams to allow them to segregate the processes that they have. So I think it's a twofold thing, but the education aspect from a corporate perspective is absolutely vital in helping companies, I believe, to deal with the overall issue of cyber fraud to start with.
Yeah, so I like that example in the beginning too, where you said there's a bucket with a lot of holes in it, and that creates a challenge. And you've used the phrase, everyone will be a victim. And I know you cited some statistics from the UK's National Crime Unit. Maybe you could just explore those examples a little bit more too.
So in terms of being a victim, this is something that we have to recognize today, that the line in terms of being at risk, individual, as much as on your personal lifestyle, as much as in terms of working for your employer, is getting grayer and grayer. For the simple reason that we've now got multiple social networking platforms. And I know that employers have brought in guidelines and practices to ensure that their employees are aware they shouldn't do certain things to compromise their roles in the company they work for. So clearly you're not going to be posting confidential information on your Facebook, for example, or even LinkedIn. But there's an element where I think there needs to be a heightened awareness of the protocol that's required for us as individuals primarily, because even as a private individual, you've got to be conscious of the fact that posting on Twitter or any of the social networking websites, if you're going on holiday for 2 weeks, is going to open yourself and your home potentially to the threat of burglary or crime. So these are little things that need to be borne in mind, but equally from a corporate perspective, that still kind of the principles come into play there. I'm seeing the statistics you're referring to as well in terms of crime. This was published a couple of years ago where the rate of return for a cyber criminal was quoted as being something like over 1,400%, because clearly the reward and frankly the effort involved for a cyber criminal to actually target a company or an individual is so much easier nowadays than, say, a burglar wanting to sort of break into a house. And then you see and you hear the high-profile stories about companies that have managed to hack into banks or companies that have been victims, either from a data perspective or from something like ransomware. They will hold the company to ransom for unlimited amounts of money in order to let them to not publish the data. In these sort of cases, I would say, again, it's really incumbent on the company and the corporate to seek, sort of this part of it's called the cybercrime prevention strategy, external support from either sort of an insurance company and or sort of companies that specialize in helping you to develop a good, secure firewall, and also just training for your own kind of internal, perhaps IT team if necessary, on sort of the practices that you could undertake to protect the company itself. So that's another point to bear in mind in terms of when I'm asked, in terms of cyber crime, who's responsible for it? And this is from a Treasury perspective we're thinking of primarily. I would say that in any company, every individual is really responsible to ensure that they protect their employer from cybercrime. And by that, I mean, it's a question of being aware of what they should and shouldn't do when you get a phone call or someone contacts you by email, you don't click on a link. And, those kind of little day-to-day instances which happen fairly regularly. I think it's up to each individual. What I will say, though, is, and we within Ferguson have this structure, our IT department are a gatekeeper, frankly. They protect us from the outside world, and that's something that they have expertise in doing. So the vast majority of our spam and our emails that try to get through our firewalls are stopped. But there are a few that still get through. So this is where, as individuals, we would then have to, and we do act and make sure we are responsible in the way we treat the emails that we get. But ultimately, it's collaboration that really is the main goal, I'd say, and the winning strategy. So what I'm encouraged to see nowadays in the meetings I've been to on cybercrime and this conferences I've attended is the increased collaboration, not only between corporates, but also between banks and the regulatory authorities, so the National Crime Unit here in the UK. And I think that's got to be encouraged more so, because the stigma of being a victim, I think, is really kind of outdated now, because frankly, there's been broadly publicized the fact that there are only two types of cyber victims: the ones that know they've been hacked and the ones that have been hacked but don't know it yet. So it's becoming more and more common. So I think it's absolutely vital that the collaboration between corporates and their third-party vendors is absolutely key. And certainly the National Crime Unit encourage the industry to report any instances of where they are aware of either an attack or they've been an unfortunate victim.
Yeah, thanks, Royston. I guess as you were talking through those things, I heard a couple items in terms of defense and responsibility. One is teamwork with the technology vendors, regulatory authorities, banks, your technology partners outside the organization. And then there's a training aspect, and then there's tech that is used to protect the organization. So teamwork, training, and technology. Now, let's explore a little further the IT and Treasury interplay and responsibilities. You had described IT as one key area of their responsibility was protecting the border. Tell me a little bit more about the Treasury side. What are they responsible to do? And I think you started talking about training and making sure people are aware of the human element of attacks and the different attack methods and strategies. But is there anything else there that we should be thinking of?
Yes, absolutely. And this is where I think as Treasury within a company, and sometimes being kind of held with the high responsibility of looking after the company's cash, let's say, it's absolutely imperative now that we recognize this area of training. And how does one address that? So there's a wealth of information. Craig, your company itself does a fantastic job of publishing podcasts and like the one we're doing now, but also material on your website that covers the whole area of cybercrime and how does one go about trying to mitigate some of those risks. But if you're looking at it from a kind of, let's say, classical perspective, I would say, first of all, you need to look at your policy, your Treasury policy, and make sure that you've taken and documented the sort of areas that you need to protect, if you like, and aid, and ensure that not from a group perspective, so not only from where you're sitting within your department, but potentially within your wider business. Because you have Treasury colleagues like we do within the wider business, and we want them to apply the same principles. And in our case, because we've got a centralized TMS solution, we're able to embed some of that security and those controls through the system, which is a great benefit, I think. And I think that's becoming more common for a lot of companies as well. So the first thing I'll say is policy. Ensure that your policy documents controls that you'd like to see applied, not just in your department, but within the wider group, because that's quite key. The second part is also equally as important, and it's your procedure. Now, that is the area I think that a lot of companies have been caught short on in terms of the way that cybercrime has evolved. Because for years, companies have been so used to typing in a payment into a standalone banking portal, and then you could argue, although it's not quite like that, almost overnight, everything's pretty much cloud-based, and you can now interact and engage with your third-party vendors using computer or internet. And somewhere along that journey, there's potentially the process of allowing an individual to have the ability to input the payment, to almost authorize the payment, and then to transmit the payment, although I'm sure that doesn't happen as much anymore, isn't really enough, isn't very secure, and shouldn't be allowed at all anymore, because it allows cyber criminals to come in there and quite easily, obviously, interrupt that process, if not take over it. So this is why I say to companies, look, review your processes and your procedures. Ensure that they're robust, ensure that they've got de facto authentication or dual approval, and look for the weak spots. And you can either do this yourself internally, or clearly you can use external consultants to come in and help you to do that. And this should be done on a regular basis, I believe, not just a once-off, because it's so critical as processes evolve, as banks evolve in some of the technology they use. They are looking and constantly monitoring those, looking out for those weaknesses. But the training aspect for your employees, I think that's another very, very important point. And I'm afraid this is, I guess, something kind of each company will, has to promote themselves. And I know it's hard and it's because everyone has limited hours in a day to find the time to go and get this extra training. But there are multiple resources that you can engage with and you can draw on. So, if you aren't able to get out to a conference or to a venue that's not in your local area, there's so many online tools. You can go to the ACT website, so you can use your website. Strategic Treasurer. There are some very good vendors online if you were to look at. I'm sure you'd find, and even if you look at the National Crime Unit, you'd be able to see on there a number of links and resources that you can obtain further information on how best to ensure that you're aware and protecting yourself as much as your employer from potential cyber criminal attack.
I think the point you mentioned, you talked about policies and then procedures. I think there's a big situation where Treasury can help fix that situation, largely because you can have a great firewall, but people can get behind the firewall if they're allowing payloads come across their email. You can create a situation where if someone does compromise email and you're accepting a process where, you can originate wire transfers by sending attachments via email. Well, if someone has captured email, they see the traffic, they see how the documents work, they're just relying on an email. If they have control of that email, they can do that. So that idea is excellent. I also liked your point about how you have to do a regular review of this, because the changes that are being done by the criminals who are committing cyber fraud and standing in the way, whether it's phishing or whether it's a system level attack or compromise, their methods are changing. I think that's excellent.
Just on that email piece, I just want to come in, Greg, just very quickly, because you remind me of something else. So another aspect that's kind of merging quite well with the whole approach to preventing cybercrime is the regulation on GDPR. And the reason I bring that in is simply this, because of what we've had to put in place to ensure that we're compliant for GDPR. It's also enabled us to ensure we're more secure from exchanging sensitive data, which historically may have been done by email. So we're now using a virtual data room to allow us to exchange any sensitive data that we might have with third parties. And that allows them to come onto this, once we give them permission, obviously, into that data room to access the data that they require, and for us to give it to them in a sort of very secure and confidential way. This could also include documentation for KYC. It's not the kind of slickest solution, in my opinion, in terms of KYC, but it certainly is getting us across the line for the time being. I'm still on the hunt for a much more universal kind of automated, perhaps even blockchain-backed solution for KYC, but let's not get into that for the time being. But certainly, what I'm saying here is the good news is that as much as cybercrime is a fairly negative topic to think of and how we approach it, it's actually driving at a lot of positive synergy and sort of solutions that I feel, particularly in terms of, as I said, the way we exchange data and potentially the way that blockchain may be used to resolve some of the outside the long kind of outstanding issues that we face in Treasury. So that's the point I wanted to make.
Yeah, excellent point. So as we think about the action that should be done, knowing what we've just discussed, what is required of Treasury, how should we think and strategize about that? Let me just, before you start answering, let me just do a summary of a few items on the situation that we talked about. The criminal attacks are very sophisticated. They're relentless. They're automated. It's no longer, like you said, a simple burglary where they're going after one item at a time. Everyone's susceptible to it. They've upped the game with technology, with understanding the human manipulation part. And so this is I don't know if you want to call it a war, but it's certainly an escalation that continues. So knowing that, what's required of Treasury to stay in front of an ongoing, escalating war with this? How do we need to think, strategize, and act on this to protect our companies?
Okay, so this comes back to the point I made earlier about collaboration. So one point I should have mentioned I failed to there was I talked about collaboration with external parties. Absolutely vital to also collaborate with your internal stakeholders, mainly your IT department. Now, we're fortunate in Ferguson, we have got a fairly large IT function in the US who are responsible for security around the IT security around our servers and our systems and so on and so forth. So I'm engaged on a regular basis with the security CISO, the person in charge of security. And what that's done in terms of, from an internal perspective, is make sure that we're both aligned in the level of security for start that we need to obtain, or at least that we need to see when we engage with a new type of software or solution provider. And more importantly, from our side, that we're also able to then give them a heads up of any potential solutions we're looking at before we come to it. This has another additional benefit, I believe, in the bigger picture. So yes, it's great, and we are collaborating with our IT colleagues. But when it comes to obtaining business sanction or approval from the powers that be, it's a big rubber stamp for us. And this is what we found to be the case for any of the solutions that we look to implement. Particularly as you're looking to implement a cloud-based solution, which is relatively new to a lot of corporates a few years ago. Once you've had your IT experts vet the solution you're looking at, and let's be clear, cloud-based solutions come under a lot more stringent regulation and compliance requirements than generally most corporates would in terms of hosting a solution. So this is why I say when they've vetted the solution and ensure that they're comfortable with it, it kind of gets you a big rubber stamp with the CFO and actually internal audit. So it's important that you have that collaboration with your internal IT function when you're looking forward at least, and making sure that they're also aware of what your landscape looks like and what you're planning to do going forward. And they can then guide you in terms of what would be good or what would be acceptable to them and what wouldn't, so that you're well prepared. And one example in this case, I would say, is very clearly, whenever we implemented a solution or looked to implement a solution, the first thing we need to know or ask the vendors, do they have relevant SOC 1 certification and the external independent audit report that validates that their application meets the industry standards requirements around security and disaster recovery. So that's definitely something say corporates need to be aware of and include in their strategy going forward.
What other activities should Treasury be looking to do, or leading practices should they implement?
So, admittedly, when you talk about cybercrime, we often, and rightly so, typically one concerned with the technical aspect of it, the IT aspect. I'm going to go back to one of the comments I made earlier on about processes and procedures, because in my view, that is really fundamentally what we have under our control in Treasury. The technology is the facilitator, and frankly, yes, the technology is a big part of how it will, it would help us, and it can help us to ensure that we're more protected. But it's fundamentally the procedures that we put in place that dictates how vulnerable, how open we could be to an attack. So the reason I'm stressing that point is the other stakeholder that I have, spent a fair bit of time with, and I think key to a lot of the solutions that we put in place, is your internal audit function. And the simple reason here is, again, coming back to the whole aspect of cybercrime and security and, sort of how robust are the systems or the solutions you put in place? Well, if you've got a solution that enables you to meet a significant number of your controls through the system by, for example, segregation of duties, by, sort of ensuring certain audit reports are sent out automatically, by making sure that you've got due approval on your payments, there's a whole list I'm sure that most companies can relate to. Then there, you've not only got complete compliance or, sort of very high compliance with your internal processes and your audit, but you've also then obviously protected yourself to that degree from the threat of any kind of external attack, whether it be cyber or physical. So for me, it's also making sure that you recognize that in trying to look at how you protect your company, your employer from attack from cyber criminals, you really need to make sure that your internal procedures are not just well documented, but robust enough, using the technology you have to enforce that protection.
Excellent, Royston. That review of the procedures in light of the changing attack, what was acceptable 10 years ago is vulnerable today. So those are wise words. Royston, any final thoughts on the topic of the impact of fraud on Treasury practices?
Yes, there is actually, and this is quite fitting in terms of kind of a final thought. So obviously we're a large FTSE 40 company. We're obliged, like most corporates, to be good corporate citizens, and we would like to believe that we also have a pretty good cyber response strategy and process. So what I would say here is that worth corporates recognizing that on top of looking at from a treasury perspective and making sure that you've got the right procedures and you engage the IT function and internal audit and you've got your controls and all of that in place, you should also be ensuring that you've got representation in your cyber crime response team. And what that would entail typically is if your company is under attack from any past business or for any reason, that you have not only someone who would be part of that team acting swiftly to ensure the damage to the company is limited, but more importantly, I would say also is that member, to be a group treasurer, is also ensuring that their team is aware of the sort of actions that need to be taken. Because so often with the way that these things work, I believe, is timing is of the essence. And I've read enough of these articles and stories to know how, I suppose, damaging it can be. And you yourself, I'm sure, Craig, has seen some of the fortunate high-profile victim cases that have been published. So it's also making sure part of the education process is not just about the process that the employee might be involved within their department, but it's also recognizing if something were to rise in terms of an attack, who do they contact first? Who's their go-to person? That information should be not just widely available, but readily available so that obviously not just the employee in Treasury, but within the whole company should be able to recognize who they need to contact to report that threat, because that's so key in terms of making sure that the threat's addressed swiftly. The other final point I'd say is in terms of insurance. So again, that's another area. If you have an insurance policy for cybercrime, this is something that we've done and we do on an annual basis or regular basis, is to engage with our insurance company. You need to identify what you'd consider your crown jewels. What are their biggest assets so that they can ensure that they address that risk appropriately. But more importantly, they will also help you to run a mock trial, if you like, to make sure that you're prepared if an event should occur where you're under attack. Now, these are much of a big picture, and they're probably not likely to affect most people working in Treasury on a sort of day-to-day basis. But it's it's a factor that needs to be taken into account, and certainly needs to be, in my view, part of a company's kind of defense mechanism.
Excellent. Royston, thank you for your time on the podcast. If it's fine, we'll make available that article that you wrote with the link on the strategictreasurer.com website. I'll also put a link in there for securetreasury.com. That is a training offering that Strategic Treasurer makes available. So Royston, thank you very much for your time on this podcast. It's been my pleasure, Craig.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.